The sun hangs low over the violet crown of Athens, casting long, stretching shadows across the dust of the agora. It is the golden hour, that brief, breathless moment when the marble of the Acropolis seems to glow from within, turning the color of honey and old parchment. The city is alive with the hum of commerce and the murmur of debate, the air thick with the scent of roasting barley, crushed olives, and the salt blowing in from the distant sea. But amidst the shifting tides of the crowd, there is one shadow that does not move. It is a silhouette etched against the dying light. A figure standing with such profound stillness that he seems less like a man and more like one of the ancient stones rooted in the earth beneath him. He is not a figure of classical beauty. In a city that worships the perfection of the human form, where the statues of gods are carved with impossible symmetry and grace, this man is a striking anomaly. He is short and stout, built like a vessel meant to hold something heavy. His eyes are set wide apart, bulging slightly from their sockets, drifting to the periphery like those of a crab, allowing him to take in the world not just in front of him, but all around him. His nose is broad and flat, with flaring nostrils that seem to drink in the air, and his lips are thick, framed by a beard that is wild and unkempt. He looks, by all accounts, like a satyr from a woodland play, a creature of the earth rather than the sky. And yet, when he speaks, or when he simply stands in this impenetrable silence, the beauty of the boys and the politicians fades into the background, rendered superficial by the sheer gravity of his presence. This is Socrates, the son of Sophroniscus and Phanerete. He is a man carved from the bedrock of Athens itself. He was not born into the silk-draped halls of the aristocracy, but into the dusty, rhythmic world of the tradesmen. His father was a stonemason, a man who understood the patience required to chip away the rough exterior of a rock to reveal the form hidden within. It is easy to imagine the young Socrates in that workshop, his hands coated in white dust, learning that creation is often an act of removal, of taking away what does not belong until only the truth remains. His mother, Phanerete, was a midwife, a woman whose hands guided new life into the precarious light of the world. She did not create the child, she merely assisted in its arrival, cutting the cord that bound the past to the future. It was a heritage Socrates would never forget. He would later say that he, too, followed his mother's trade, though he dealt not in infants, but in ideas. He saw himself as a midwife of the soul, a barren man who could not birth wisdom himself, but who possessed the strange, terrifying power to help others deliver the truths they carried unknowingly within them. But before he was the sage of the marketplace, he was a man of the shield line. The history of Athens is written in ink and blood, and Socrates, despite his later reputation as a wandering thinker, was a hardened instrument of that history. He was a hoplite, a heavy infantryman, and the records of his life are punctuated by the clash of bronze and the screams of the dying. He marched to the frozen north, to the siege of Ptidia, where the wind whipped off the Thracian mountains with a bite that froze the marrow. It was there, in the bitter cold of the campaign, that the soldiers first noticed the strangeness of the man. While others wrapped themselves in layers of wool and felt, binding their feet in fleece to ward off the frost, Socrates walked barefoot across the ice. He wore the same thin, rough cloak he wore in the heat of summer, marching with a steady, rhythmic gait that seemed immune to the elements. He was not defying the cold. He simply seemed not to notice it, as if his mind dwelled in a place where the temperature of the skin was a triviality, unworthy of attention. There is a story, whispered by the men who served alongside him, of a day during that siege when the separation between Socrates and the rest of the world became absolute. It began at sunrise. Something had caught his mind, a thought, a problem, a tangle of logic that required his full being to unravel. He stopped in his tracks, standing just outside the tents. He stood there as the camp woke up. He stood there as the morning drills began. Soldiers passed him, joking, nudging one another, expecting him to move, to blink, to shake off the reverie. But he did not. Noon came, the sun climbing high and bright, beating down on his exposed head. He did not shift his weight. He did not call for water. He was a statue of flesh, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance, his breath slow and shallow. The day wore on, and the shadows lengthened. The jeers of the soldiers turned to hushed whispers, then to a kind of superstitious awe. Was he possessed? Was he communing with a god? Or had he simply stepped out of time? Night fell, bringing the biting frost back to the air. Some of the Ionians, curious and unnerved, brought their sleeping mats out into the cold, lying on the ground nearby just to watch him, to see if he would finally break. The constellations wheeled overhead, the great hunter Orion stalking across the dark canvas of the night, and still Socrates stood. He remained there, locked in that vertical slumber, until the sun rose the following morning. Only when the first rays of the new dawn touched his face did he move. He offered a simple prayer to the sun, turned, and walked away as if he had merely paused to tie a sandal. He had stood for 24 hours, untethered from the physical world, exploring a landscape that only he could see. It was this immense capacity for internal focus that defined him, a power that seemed guided by a force he called his daimonion. It was a divine sign, a voice that had been with him since childhood. But unlike the commands of the generals or the urges of ambition, this voice was purely negative. It never told him what to do, it only ever told him what not to do. It was a check, a bridle on the soul, stopping him mid-sentence, halting him before he walked down a certain path, forbidding him from entering the corrupting arena of politics. It was a divine hesitation, ensuring that his life remained narrow, focused, and unpolluted by the compromises of power. This internal compass would eventually lead him to the most pivotal moment of his life, a moment sparked not by a battlefield command, but by a riddle from the mountains. His friend, the impetuous Chariphon, had journeyed to the sacred precinct of Delphi, climbing the winding path to the temple of Apollo. There, amidst the vapors and the laurel leaves, he asked the oracle a simple question: "Is there anyone wiser than Socrates?" The Pythia, the high priestess, gave a response that would shatter the foundations of Socrates' life. She said simply, "No one." When the news was brought back to Athens, Socrates was horrified. He did not feel wise. He felt acutely, painfully aware of his own ignorance. He looked at the world, at the stars, the laws, the nature of virtue, and saw only questions, never answers. How could the God of truth call him the wisest of men? It seemed a divine mockery, driven by a need to prove the oracle wrong, or perhaps to understand the riddle. Socrates began his great investigation. He went to the politicians who spoke of justice with thundering rhetoric, but when he questioned them, he found they had no understanding of what justice actually was. He went to the poets, who wrote beautiful verses about the gods, but found they could not explain the meaning of their own words, acting only as vessels for inspiration. They did not comprehend. He went to the craftsmen, the artisans who built the temples and forged the weapons. They knew their trades well, but because they knew how to shape stone or temper bronze, they arrogantly believed they also knew the secrets of high matters of how a state should be governed, or how a man should live. Slowly, the silhouette in the sun began to understand. The oracle was not saying that Socrates possessed a library of hidden facts. The oracle was saying that in a world of sleepwalkers who believed they were awake, Socrates alone knew that he was dreaming. He was the wisest, because he was the only one who admitted he knew nothing. This realization, Socratic ignorance, was not a surrender. It was a weapon, and so he turned his back on the study of the clouds and the physics of the cosmos, the natural philosophy of his teacher Archelaus. He brought philosophy down from the heavens and planted it firmly in the dust of the agora. He would no longer ask how the sun moved. He would ask how the soul should move. The sun has now fully set over Athens, and the torches are being lit. The noise of the day is quieting, but for Socrates the work is just beginning. He adjusts his cloak, the rough wool scratching against his shoulder, and steps out of the shadow, walking calmly toward a group of young men gathering near the portico, ready to begin the conversation that will eventually kill him. He does not look like a man who is about to change the history of the world. To the casual observer watching from the shade of the painted stoa, Socrates appears closer to a mythical beast than a refined intellectual. He is barefoot, as he always is, his calloused soles moving silently over the warm stones of the marketplace. He wears the same simple, rough woolen cloak he wears in winter and summer, a garment that has seen the dust of roads and the stain of wine. He is undeniably ugly by the rigid standards of Athenian beauty, a society that worships the symmetrical perfection of marble statues. He possesses a broad, flat face with a snub nose and wide, flaring nostrils, resembling a satyr or the Silenus figures painted on wine jugs. His eyes are his most arresting feature, bulging and set wide apart, giving him a crab-like ability to see not just what is in front of him, but what moves in the periphery. He often jokes about this face, claiming his protruding eyes are superior because they gather more light and his thick lips are softer for kissing. But beneath this disarming, grotesque exterior lies a magnetic charm that pulls the city's youth toward him like moths to a lantern. He carries the legacy of his parents in the very way he speaks. He is the son of Sophoniscus, a stonemason and sculptor, and in many ways Socrates has continued the family trade. But where his father took a chisel to blocks of rough marble, chipping away the excess to reveal the form of a god or a grace hidden within, Socrates takes his chisel to the human soul. He believes that the truth is already there, buried under layers of pretension, ego, and confused societal beliefs. His questions are the strikes of the hammer, knocking away the false assumptions, the hollow definitions, and the arrogance, until only the sturdy, undeniable core of truth remains. He is also the son of Phanerete, a midwife. He speaks of this often, his voice low and rumbling, telling the young men who gather around him that he too practices the art of delivery. He claims to be barren of wisdom himself, just as a midwife is past the age of childbearing. He cannot teach anyone anything, for he possesses no doctrine. Instead, he attends to the labor of others. When a young student struggles with a new idea, sweating and straining to define justice or virtue, Socrates is there to assist the birth, checking to see if the child is a healthy truth or a wind egg of phantom arrogance. It is a painful process, this birthing of the mind, and many who come to him leave in frustration, unable to bear the labor pains of thinking for themselves. But before he was the midwife of the agora, he was a warrior of Athens. As he stands now, leaning against a stone pillar, his posture reveals the deep, latent strength of a veteran hoplite. He is no frail scholar. Beneath that cloak is a body hardened by years of marching and the brutal crush of the phalanx. He remembers the biting cold of Potodaya, a campaign far to the north, where the frost was so severe that other soldiers wrapped their feet in felt and sheepskins, shivering in their tents. Socrates had walked out onto the ice in his bare feet, wearing only his thin cloak, marching with a steady, indifferent rhythm that baffled his comrades. It was there amidst the siege and the snow that the men first saw the terrifying extent of his focus. One morning the camp awoke to find Socrates standing in a secluded spot, staring at nothing, lost in absolute stillness. He had snagged his mind on a problem, a knot in the thread of logic he could not untangle. The sun rose, climbing high over the glittering white fields, and still he did not move. The soldiers ate their midday meal, watching him with superstition and awe. The sun began to dip, casting long violet shadows across the snow, and he remained a statue of flesh, his breath misting softly in the freezing air. Night fell, and the Ionians brought out their sleeping mats to watch him, whispering that he was communing with the gods or traveling through the ether. He stood there for 24 hours, from one sunrise to the next, until the sun greeted him again. Only then did he blink, offer a prayer to the new day, and walk calmly away, the problem in his mind seemingly resolved. He brings that same terrifying endurance to the dinner parties of Athens. At the symposium, where wine flows from great mixing bowls and the flute girls play their hypnotic melodies, Socrates is a legend. He could outdrink any man in the city, consuming cup after cup of heavy wine, yet his speech never slurs and his mind never dulls. While others collapse into stupors or rise in drunken anger, he remains lucid, his eyes clear, discussing the nature of love, until the dawn breaks and the roosters crow. He views the body not as a master to be obeyed, but as a spirited horse that must be tamed by the rider of reason. Yet, for all his public calmness, there is a chaotic storm in his private life. He returns home to Xanthip, a woman much younger than himself, whose temperament is as fiery as his is cool. The rumors of their arguments echo through the neighborhood, the shouting, the upturned tables. In one famous instance, after a thunderous lecture from her, she doused him with a bucket of water as he sat on his doorstep. He simply wiped his face and smiled, remarking to a passer-by, "I always said that after the thunder comes the rain." He does not hate her for this. In fact, he claims he chose her precisely for her spirit, just as a horse trainer chooses a wild stallion to prove his skill. If he can keep his temper with Xanthippe, he reasons, he can keep his composure with anyone in all of Greece. But there is a voice that speaks to him louder than Xanthippe, louder than the generals, louder even than the assembly of the people. He calls it his daimonion, a divine sign that has visited him since childhood. It is a peculiar phenomenon, a sudden, distinct internal signal that never commands him to act, but only forbids him. It is a check, a rein pulling back. When he prepares to walk down a certain street, the voice whispers, "No," and he turns aside. When he thought to enter the dangerous arena of politics, the voice forbade it, saving him for this higher purpose. He trusts this silence, this divine prohibition, more than he trusts the laws of men. Now, as the twilight deepens over the agora, Socrates spots a young aristocrat, perhaps a poet or a future statesman, preening in his fine robes. The man is speaking loudly about the nature of justice, confident in his inherited opinions. Socrates feels the familiar pull. The daimonion is silent. He is free to proceed. He pushes off from the pillar, his ugly, beautiful face lighting up with a feigned innocence. He approaches the young man not as a teacher, but as a student, bowing his head slightly. "Hail, friend," Socrates says, his voice raspy and warm. "I couldn't help but overhear you speak of justice. You seem to know exactly what it is." "I have been searching for that definition all my life. Perhaps you would be kind enough to teach me?" The hook is set. The young man puffs out his chest, flattered, unaware that he is stepping into a labyrinth from which his ego will not return intact. Socrates begins his work, the stonecutter chipping away the first flake of marble. He asks a simple question, then another, and another, gently steering the conversation until the young man's contradictions are laid bare, until the definition of justice collapses into dust, leaving them both in a state of aporia, a purgatory of confusion, where true wisdom begins. But as the years pass and the war with Sparta grinds toward a humiliating defeat for Athens, the mood in the city begins to darken. The laughter that once greeted Socrates' eccentricities is turning into suspicion. The people are tired, hungry, and looking for someone to blame for the decay of their democracy. They see the young men who follow Socrates' men like Alcibiades, who betrayed the city, and Critias, the cruelest of the 30 tyrants. And they begin to wonder if the sculptor is carving monsters. The shadows in the agora are growing longer, stretching toward the steps of the royal stoa, where the king Archon waits to receive indictments. The old man continues his questions, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the city he loves is slowly turning against him, preparing to ask him a question of its own, one that will require an answer paid in blood, the silensatia. To understand why the old man does not flinch as the whispers in Athens turn to threats, one must look past the philosopher's cloak and see the body beneath it. Before he was the gadfly of the agora, stinging the lazy horse of democracy into wakefulness, Socrates was a man of stone and iron. The citizens who now eye him with suspicion, wondering if he is a corrupter of youth or a traitor to the gods, often forget that the hands now gesturing in delicate argumentation once held a spear, and the shoulders now hunched in debate once bore the crushing weight of a hoplite's shield. To understand the mind that would not bend, we must witness the body that would not break. He was never a creature of the elite, born into silk and symposia. He was cut from the rough, dusty quarry of the Demi-Alopes. His father, Sophronius, was a stonemason, a man who taught the young Socrates the patience required to liberate a form from the unforgiving marble. It is said that in his youth, Socrates himself took a chisel to the stone, perhaps carving the draped figures of the three graces that stood at the entrance to the Acropolis. This early communion with rock settled into his bones. He learned that beauty and truth are not painted on the surface, but are hidden deep within, requiring hard, persistent strikes to reveal. From his mother, Phanerete, a midwife, he learned a different kind of labor, the art of bringing new life into the world through pain and breath. He would later say he merely combined the trades of his parents. Like his father, he sought the hard structure of truth, and like his mother, he delivered the souls of men of their ideas, acting as a midwife to wisdom. But before he walked the marketplace as a sage, he marched the frozen roads of the north as a soldier. The Peloponnesian War, that long devouring struggle between Athens and Sparta, demanded the service of every able citizen, and Socrates did not shy away from the call. He donned the bronze helmet, the greaves, and the breastplate, transforming the thinker into a heavy infantryman. It was at the siege of Potidaea, far to the north in the bitter chill of Thrace, that the legend of his physical endurance began to take shape. The campaign was brutal. The Athenian supply lines were thin, and the winter came down with a ferocity that turned breath to ice and made the blood sluggish in the veins. While other soldiers, men of noble birth and soft upbringing, wrapped themselves in layers of wool and felt, cursing the frost that blackened their toes, Socrates walked through the camp in his usual thin, threadbare cloak. He marched barefoot across the ice, his steps sure and steady, leaving prints in the snow that the others looked at with disbelief. He did not shiver. He did not complain. It was as if his mind had issued a decree to his body that the cold was merely a sensation, not a master to be obeyed. The soldiers watched him, some with admiration, others with a touch of resentment, feeling that his resilience was a silent rebuke to their own suffering. But the true measure of his strangeness and his power was revealed one morning when the camp was stirring to life. Socrates had fallen into a thought. A problem of logic or ethics had snagged his mind, and he stopped in his tracks to unravel it. He stood there, just outside his tent, motionless. The sun rose, climbing the grey winter sky, casting long shadows across the white fields. Soldiers passed him, went about their drills, ate their meals, and returned, yet Socrates had not moved. He was not asleep. His eyes were open, fixed on a point in the middle distance, seeing something beyond the visible world. Noon came and went. The afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and orange. Still he stood. Word spread through the camp. Men gathered in the distance, whispering, pointing at the statue of a man who breathed but did not move. As evening fell and the biting cold returned, some of the Ionians, curious and awed, brought out their sleeping mats and set them up nearby, determined to see how long he would last. They watched him through the long, freezing night. The stars wheeled overhead, the constellations shifting their positions in the great cosmic dance, but Socrates remained a fixed point, an axis around which the world turned. He stood there for 24 hours, from one sunrise to the next, locked in a trance of pure concentration, oblivious to the frost settling on his beard. Only when the sun greeted the earth the following morning did he blink, take a deep breath, offer a prayer to the sun, and walk away as if he had merely paused to tie a sandal. This terrifying discipline was not just a parlor trick. It was the manifestation of a soul in complete command of its vessel. It was this same discipline that saved the life of Alcibiades. In the heat of battle at Potidaea, when the lines clashed and the air filled with the metallic scream of bronze on bronze, the young, beautiful, and reckless Alcibiades fell wounded. He was the golden youth of Athens, the future of the city, and he lay helpless as the enemy closed in to finish him. The rest of the line wavered, but Socrates stepped forward. He stood over the fallen boy like a lion, his shield raised, his spear keeping the attackers at bay. He was a wall that could not be breached. He saved Alcibiades, both his life and his armor. a deed that would bind the two men together in a complex tapestry of love and tragedy for decades to come. Years later, at the Battle of Delium, the Athenians suffered a catastrophic defeat. The line broke and panic seized the army. Men threw down their shields and ran, a chaotic, terrified stampede of survival. But amidst the rout, one figure moved with an eerie, swaggering calm. It was Socrates. He was retreating, yes, but he was not running. He walked with his head high, his large, wide-set eyes darting from side to side, scanning the horizon like a crab, taking in both friend and foe. The general Lucas, fleeing for his life, later recounted that Socrates seemed so dangerous, so utterly composed in the midst of the slaughter, that the pursuing cavalry gave him a wide berth. They saw a man who was ready to kill if touched, a man who did not smell of fear. While others were hunted down and cut to pieces, Socrates and his few companions walked off the battlefield untouched, protected by the sheer force of his presence. This courage was not the hot-headed bravery of a youth seeking glory. It was the cold, hard courage of a man who listens to a different authority. Socrates often spoke of his daimonion, a divine sign or voice that had visited him since childhood. Unlike the commands of the generals or the decrees of the assembly, this voice never told him what to do. It was a voice of negation, a divine stop. It spoke only to forbid him from entering a course of action that was wrong or dangerous. When the voice was silent, Socrates moved forward with absolute certainty. When it spoke, he froze, immovable as the stones of the Acropolis. It was this internal governor that kept him from the moral rot of politics. It whispered to him that to enter the political arena of Athens, a place of compromise, flattery, and corruption, would be the death of his soul before he could ever complete his work. So he remained a private citizen, a soldier of the mind, fighting a war not against Spartans but against ignorance. This endurance, this capacity to withstand the cold, the wine, the fear of death, and even the fiery temper of his wife Xantippe, whom he claimed to have chosen specifically because her difficult nature was the perfect training ground for a philosopher, was the foundation of his wisdom. He believed that the body must be the servant of the soul. If a man could not command his own hunger, his own shivering, or his own fear, how could he hope to command the slippery concepts of justice and virtue? He was often seen at the symposiums, the drinking parties of the elite, where the wine flowed like water. As the night wore on and the greatest minds of Athens slurred their speech and stumbled into stupors, Socrates would continue to drink cup after cup, his conversation becoming only more lucid, his wit sharper. He would outlast them all, watching them fall one by one to the influence of Dionysus, while he remained sober, greeting the dawn with clear eyes before heading to the Lyceum to wash and begin his day. It was this man, the soldier, who could stand in the snow for a day and a night, the warrior who walked calmly through a rout, the drinker who could not be drunk, who now stood in the agora, preparing for the greatest battle of his life. He had turned his back on the study of the heavens, on the physics of clouds and stars that had fascinated him in his youth under the tutelage of Archelaus. He had realized that knowing the composition of the sun meant nothing if the men beneath it did not know how to live. He had brought philosophy down from the sky and planted it in the dusty earth of the marketplace. But the earth was shifting, the city was looking for a scapegoat, and the oracle at Delphi had set a riddle that would lead this silent soldier directly into the path of the storm. The question was no longer about the movement of the stars or the nature of matter. The question was about wisdom itself, and why the gods had declared that no one in Greece was wiser than the man who claimed to know nothing at all. The road to wisdom, it seems, often begins not with a statement, but with a journey into the unknown. While Socrates walked the familiar, dusty streets of Athens, his shadow stretching long against the limestone walls, a different journey was being undertaken on his behalf, a journey that would alter the course of his life and, eventually, the history of human thought. It was his friend Chaerephon, a man known for his impetuous spirit and eager curiosity, who made the pilgrimage to the navel of the ancient world. He travelled north, leaving behind the noise of the city for the sacred silence of the mountains, climbing the steep, winding path up the slopes of Mount Parnassus to the sanctuary of Delphi. Here the air was different, thinner, crisper, scented with bay laurel and pine. Here the earth itself seemed to speak. Chariphon approached the temple of Apollo, where the maxim, "Know thyself," was carved into the stone, a silent command to all who entered. He sought the Pythia, the high priestess who sat atop a golden tripod over a chasm in the earth, inhaling the sweet, intoxicating vapors that rose from the depths. In the dim, flickering light of the sanctuary, amidst the smoke of offerings, Chariphon dared to ask a question that was both simple and audacious. He did not ask about the outcome of a war or the yield of a harvest. He asked if there was anyone in all of Greece who was wiser than Socrates, the son of Sophroniscus. The Pythia, channeling the voice of the god Apollo, gave a reply that was brief, unequivocal, and devastatingly clear. No one is wiser. When Chariphon returned to Athens, descending from the mist of the oracle back to the heat of the marketplace, he brought this prophecy to Socrates. One might expect a man to receive such news with pride, to nod in agreement with the gods. But Socrates was paralyzed by confusion. He looked at his rough hands, the hands of a former stonemason, and he looked into his own mind. He found there no great theories of the universe, no encyclopedic knowledge of history, no certainty about the nature of the soul. He felt with absolute conviction that he knew nothing. He possessed no wisdom at all, neither great nor small. Yet he was a pious man. He could not believe the god would lie, for truth was the nature of the divine. And so, caught between his own self-knowledge of ignorance and the divine declaration of his wisdom, Socrates felt a burden settle upon his shoulders. He viewed the oracle not as a trophy, but as a riddle, a divine paradox that he was duty-bound to solve. To understand what the god meant, he decided he must find a man wiser than himself. If he could find just one person who truly knew the nature of virtue and goodness, he could go to the oracle and say, "Here is a man wiser than I," and thereby refute the prophecy. And so began the famous mission, a philosophical odyssey that took place not on the high seas, but in the porticos and gymnasiums of Athens. He began with the politicians, the men who guided the state, who spoke with thundering voices about justice and honor. Socrates approached a prominent statesman, a man with a great reputation for wisdom, followed by a crowd of admirers. With gentle, deferential questions, Socrates began to probe. He asked for definitions of the virtue the man spoke of so freely. What is justice? What is piety? As the conversation unfolded under the bright Athenian sun, the layers of the statesman's confidence began to peel away. It became painfully clear to the onlookers, and eventually to the man himself, that he did not actually know what he was talking about. He had opinions, he had rhetoric, he had custom, but he did not have knowledge. He could not define the very things he claimed to understand. Socrates walked away from that encounter with a heavy realization. I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything to the purpose. But he thinks that he knows something when he does not, whereas I, being ignorant, do not think that I know. He did not stop there. He went to the poets, the tragedians whose plays moved audiences to tears. He asked them to explain the meaning of their own beautiful passages, but the poets, he found, could not explain their art. They wrote by a sort of instinct or inspiration, like seers or soothsayers who say many fine things but do not understand the meaning of them. The wisdom was in the poem, not in the poet. Finally, he turned to the craftsmen, the artisans, the smiths, the shoemakers. Surely here was knowledge, and indeed these men knew things Socrates did not. They knew how to forge a shield, how to cure leather, how to build a wall. But because they were masters of their trade, they fell into the trap of believing they were also masters of high matters, of how to run a state, or how to live a good life. Their specific knowledge blinded them to their general ignorance. Slowly, the riddle of the oracle unraveled. Socrates realized that the god was not saying Socrates was omniscient. The god was using Socrates as an example, as if to say, the wisest among you, mortals, is he who, like Socrates, understands that his wisdom is worthless. It was a wisdom of negation, a recognition of the vast infinite horizon of what is not known. This was Socratic ignorance, the humility to stand before the vast complexity of the world and admit, "I do not know." This mission, however, came at a steep price. In exposing the ignorance of the powerful, the wealthy and the proud, Socrates did not win friends. He became a stinging fly on the flank of a sluggish horse, waking the city from its slumber, but also irritating those who preferred to sleep. He was driven not just by the oracle, but by a strange internal phenomenon he called his daimonion. Since his childhood, Socrates had heard a voice. It was a divine sign, a personal auditor of his soul. Crucially, this voice never commanded him to do anything. It never told him to speak, to act, or to go. It was purely apophatic. It only told him what not to do. It was a voice of restraint. If he was about to make a mistake, if he was about to agree to something unjust, or leave a conversation too early, the sign would come, holding him back, freezing him in place. It was this daimonion that forbade him from entering politics, saving him, he believed, from an early death and preserving him for this higher calling of philosophy. He walked through the city, guided by this silence and this voice, a figure of striking contradictions. In a culture that worshipped physical perfection, where the outer form was believed to reflect the inner soul, Socrates was aggressively, proudly ugly. He had the face of a satyr with bulging, wide-set eyes that he jokingly claimed were superior because they could see sideways, guarding him from ambush. His nose was flat, with flaring nostrils, which he argued could smell more scent than a delicate nose. His lips were thick and framed by a wild, unkempt beard. He walked barefoot on the ice of winter and the burning stones of summer, wearing the same threadbare cloak year-round. He was a man who seemed carved from the earth itself, durable and unyielding. Yet his domestic life was as turbulent as his public life was controversial. He returned home not to a silent sanctuary, but to Xanthippe, his wife. History has often painted her unkindly as a shrewish woman who harangued the great philosopher, but perhaps she was merely the only one who saw the man, not the legend the husband who brought no money home, who spent his days talking to strangers while the pantry emptied. There is a story of a day when the arguments in their small house rose like a storm. Xanthippe's voice thundered against his philosophical calm, and finally, in frustration, she emptied a chamber pot over his head as he sat by the door. Socrates, dripping wet, merely wiped his face and smiled at the gathered neighbors. "Did I not tell you," he said softly, "that after the thunder comes the rain?" It was a moment of supreme patience, but also of distance. He treated the tribulations of marriage with the same detached curiosity as he treated the questions of the universe. He saw himself, in these later years, returning to the trade of his mother. Thenarete had been a midwife, bringing children into the world. Socrates, barren of his own wisdom, declared himself a midwife of the soul. He could not teach truth, for he had none to give, but through his questioning, through the gentle, relentless pressure of his logic, he could help others deliver the ideas that were growing within them. He could test those offspring to see if they were healthy truths or mere phantoms of ego. He stood in the agora, a midwife attending the birth of the Western mind, unaware that the city he loved was slowly turning against him. The sun was setting on the golden age of Athens, and the shadows were lengthening. The humor of his questions was being lost in the fear of the times. The man who knew too much about the limits of human knowledge was about to learn the limits of human tolerance. The whispers began to coalesce into a roar, and the path from the oracle's praise was leading him, step by inevitable step, toward the stillness of a prison cell. The air grew heavy, not with the vapors of Delphi, but with the gathering storm of judgment. To understand the gathering storm, one had to look past the stone columns of the porticos and into the face of the man standing at its center. In a city that worshipped the perfection of the physical form, where young men oiled their bodies in the gymnasium to resemble the marble gods that watched over them, Socrates was a living paradox. He was, by all accounts of the time, aggressively ugly, a stark dissonance in the symphony of Athenian beauty. He possessed the snub nose of a satyr, with wide, flaring nostrils that seemed to drink in the air of the city. His eyes were not deep-set and brooding like a tragedian's, but bulging and wide-set, reminiscent of a crab, allowing him, he joked, to see not just what was in front of him, but the world on either side. His lips were thick and framed a mouth that could outdrink the hardiest revellers and outtalk the most skilled sophists. Yet those who stopped to listen found that this rough, clay-like exterior housed a golden interior. He was often compared to the statues of Silenus sold in the stone-cutters' shops, hollow figures of the ugly tutor of Dionysus that, when opened, revealed glittering statues of the gods inside. This duality was the essence of his being. He was a man who walked barefoot through the dust and frost alike, wearing the same thin, threadbare cloak in summer and winter, indifferent to the comforts that enslaved his peers. He was a citizen of Alapis, but he belonged to no class, sitting nowhere and everywhere, a strange singularity in the social fabric of the city. He carried the legacy of his parents, not in his pocket, for he had no money, but in the very method of his thought. His father, Socrates, had been a stoneworker, a man who took raw, unformed blocks of the earth and chipped away the excess to reveal the structure within. In his youth, Socrates too had held the chisel, and tradition whispered that he had even carved the graces that stood at the entrance to the Acropolis. But he had laid down the iron tools of the mason to take up the invisible tools of his mother. Her name was Finarity, and she was a midwife. Socrates spoke of her often with a reverence that transcended filial duty. He saw himself as the spiritual successor to her trade. A midwife, he would explain to the ambitious young men who gathered around him, is too old to bear children herself. Yet she knows the signs of labor better than anyone. She knows how to induce the birth, how to cut the cord, and most importantly, how to inspect the newborn to see if it is healthy or a monstrous phantom that must be discarded. Socrates claimed he was barren of wisdom. He had no truths of his own to teach, no great doctrines to impart. He was merely the attendant. When he questioned a man about justice or courage or piety, he was inducing the labor pains of the soul. He watched as his companions sweated and struggled, their minds contorting in the agony of bringing a new idea into the light. And when the definition was finally delivered, Socrates, the ruthless midwife, would inspect it. If the idea was hollow, if it was born of ego or falsehood, he would cast it aside, regardless of the pain it caused the parent. This relentless purging was guided by something far more mysterious than mere logic. Since his childhood, Socrates had been haunted or blessed by a phenomenon he called his daimonion. It was a divine sign, a voice that manifested in the quiet corners of his mind. Unlike the hallucinations of madmen or the grand pronouncements of prophets, this voice was curiously restrained. It never issued commands. It never told him what to do. It was a purely negative force, a divine inhibition. When he prepared to walk a certain path, or speak a certain word, or enter the murky waters of political office, the sign would appear, a sudden psychic wall that said simply, no. It was a check on his hubris, a guardian of his destiny that steered him away from the compromises of public life and kept him in the streets among the people, where the true work of philosophy could be done. This inner stillness, this ability to listen to the silence within, granted him a fortitude that baffled his contemporaries. The Athenians knew him as the old man of the agora, but there were those who remembered him as something else entirely, a warrior. The soft, philosophizing paunch of his later years belied a constitution of iron forged in the fires of the Peloponnesian War. He had stood in the phalanx, a hoplite in heavy bronze armor, his shield locked with his neighbors, pressing against the weight of the Spartan allies at the siege of Potidaea. Far to the north, amidst the biting winds of Thrace, the soldiers of Athens saw a glimpse of the terrifying power of his mind. One morning, something snagged his thoughts a problem, a definition, a loose thread in the fabric of logic that he could not disentangle. He stopped moving. He stood there barefoot in the freezing mud, lost in contemplation. The sun rose high overhead, heating the armor of the men around him, but Socrates did not move. The camp bustled with the chaotic noise of war, the sharpening of swords, the shouting of orders, but he remained a statue of flesh. As the day wore on, the soldiers began to whisper. They pointed at the stonemason who had turned to stone. Evening came, and the soldiers, curious and awed, brought their sleeping mats out into the cold just to watch him. The stars wheeled overhead, the constellations shifting their positions in the great dome of the night, and still he stood, unblinking, breathing shallowly, his mind travelling distances they could not comprehend. He remained there for 24 hours, until the sun rose the following morning. Only then, with the problem solved or the thought exhausted, did he offer a prayer to the sun, turn, and walk away as if he had merely paused to tie a sandal. This was the man who saved the life of Alcibiades, the golden boy of Athens. In the heat of battle, when the lines broke and chaos reigned, the young, wounded aristocrat had fallen. It was Socrates who stood over him, shield raised, fighting off the enemy with a calm ferocity, protecting the future statesman not for glory. He later tried to insist the prize of valor be given to Alcibiades, but because it was the right thing to do. He knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the knowledge of what is truly to be feared, and Socrates feared ignorance more than death. He returned from the wars not to a hero's welcome of gold and estate, but to a deliberate, ascetic simplicity. He owned almost nothing. He walks the marketplace, looking at the wares, the imported silks, the silver goblets, the spices, and would remark with genuine delight, "How many things there are that I do not need." His freedom was absolute because his wants were non-existent, yet his domestic life was grounded in the friction of the mundane. He returned home to Xanthippe, a woman whose name would become synonymous with the shrewish wife, though history has perhaps judged her too harshly. She was much younger than him, saddled with a husband who brought home no wages, who spent his days talking to strangers while their cupboard stood bare, and who refused to participate in the politics that might have granted them status. The stories of their strife were legendary in the gossip circles of Athens. It was said that once, after a long haranguing lecture in the market square, Socrates returned home to a furious Xanthippe. She screamed at him, her frustration boiling over at his indifference to their poverty, and when her words failed to break his calm, she seized a chamber pot and emptied its contents over his head. The philosopher, dripping and unperturbed, merely wiped his face and smiled at the onlookers. "I did say," he remarked gently, "that after the thunder there would come rain." Yet beneath the friction there was a bond. He claimed that he chose her specifically because of her fiery spirit, just as a horse trainer chooses a spirited beast to refine his skill. If he could maintain his composure with Xanthippe, he reasoned, he could handle the rest of humanity with ease. He found his respite not in solitude, but in the symposium, the drinking parties of the intellectual elite. Here, the midwife would lay on the couch, cup in hand, surrounded by the brightest minds of the age. As the night deepened and the wine flowed, as the flute girls played and the other guests succumbed to drunkenness, slurring their speech and stumbling into incoherence, Socrates remained lucid. He could drink any man under the table, yet the wine seemed to have no effect on the fortress of his mind. He viewed this physical endurance as a mirror of his spiritual discipline. The body was a vessel, and he was its absolute master. But the laughter of the symposium was fading. The questions he asked were no longer seen as eccentricities. They were beginning to feel like accusations. Athens had lost the war. The Spartan occupation and the rule of the 30 tyrants had left the city traumatized, paranoid, and looking for someone to blame for the decay of their golden age. Socrates, with his constant questioning of authority, his refusal to accept traditional definitions of piety, and his close association with men who had hurt the city like the traitorous Alcibiades and the tyrant Critias, was becoming a figure of suspicion. He had spent his life trying to awaken the city, describing himself as a gadfly sent by the gods to sting a lazy horse into action. But a horse that is stung too often does not gallop. It kicks. The stinging had gone on for decades. The young men who followed him were dissecting the traditions of their fathers with ruthless logic, and the fathers were watching with growing unease. The science of his youth, the study of clouds and stars he had abandoned, was being conflated with his moral questioning, painting him as an atheist who believed in new gods. The atmosphere in the agora shifted. The smiles of the shopkeepers became strained. The politicians he had embarrassed in public began to whisper in the shadows. The oracle had called him the wisest of men, but the wisdom of the gods is often a curse to the mortal who bears it. Socrates continued his work, walking the familiar stones, stopping to ask, "What is justice?" to men who were increasingly interested only in revenge. He did not see, or perhaps he chose to ignore, the parchment that was being prepared, the indictment that would transform him from a nuisance into a martyr. The sun was dipping low over the Parthenon, casting long, distorted shadows across the marketplace, and the midwife of the soul was about to be called to account to the children he had brought into the world. The shadows that stretched across the agora were not merely tricks of the fading light, nor were they simply the optical distortions of a setting sun playing upon white marble. They were the manifestations of a deeper spiritual twilight that had descended upon the great city of Athens. The Golden Age, that brief blinding explosion of art, democracy, and empire, was fracturing under the weight of its own hubris. The city had survived the plague, it had survived the humiliating defeat by Sparta, and it had survived the brutal, blood-soaked reign of the 30 tyrants. But it had emerged from these trials scarred, paranoid, and deeply suspicious of anything that smelled of subversion. In this atmosphere of convalescence and fear, the familiar figure of Socrates, once viewed as a harmless eccentric, a local character to be gently mocked, began to take on a more sinister shape in the minds of his fellow citizens. He was no longer just the barefoot philosopher who questioned the price of fish or the definition of virtue. To the anxious eyes of a recovering democracy, he became a remnant of the chaos they wished to forget. He was the teacher of Alcibiades, the brilliant traitor who had switched sides to Sparta. He was the associate of Critias, the most ruthless of the tyrants who had executed citizens without trial. Guilt by association is a potent poison, and it was seeping into the groundwater of Athenian discourse. The indictment, when it finally appeared, was not a sudden thunderclap, but the inevitable result of a gathering storm. It was posted at the royal stoa, the office of the king archon, the magistrate responsible for religious affairs. The parchment was unassuming, yet it bore the weight of a death sentence. The words were scratched into the record by Meletus, a young and ambitious poet with a beak-like nose and lank hair, who acted as the public face of the accusation. But behind the young poet stood the true power, Anytus, a wealthy tenor and prominent politician who represented the restored democracy and the traditional values of the craftsman. The charges were stark, written in the dry, legalistic Greek of the courts, yet they carried a hysterical undertone. Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth, the indictment read, and of not believing in the gods whom the city believes in, but of other new divinities. These were capital offences. In a city where the favour of the gods was considered essential for survival, atheism or heresy was not just a personal belief. It was a threat to national security. If one man offended the gods, the entire fleet might sink in a storm. News of the indictment rippled through the city, carried by the whispers of slaves and the gossip of merchants. It reached the potters' workshops in the Kerameikos and the gymnasiums, where young men oiled their bodies for wrestling. But when the news reached Socrates himself, it was met with a tranquility that bordered on indifference. He did not rush to prepare a defense. He did not seek out powerful allies to beg for mercy. He simply continued his daily routine, his bare feet moving rhythmically over the dust, his cloak worn thin by the seasons wrapped loosely around his sturdy frame. To the observer, his calmness was baffling. How could a man stand at the precipice of death and not tremble? The answer lay in the very impiety he was accused of. Socrates was guided not by the fickle gods of Olympus with their petty jealousies and human-like rages, but by his daimonion, that mysterious divine sign that had been his companion since childhood. This inner voice, a sensation distinct from his own thoughts, had always functioned as a divine prohibition. It would speak to him when he was about to make a mistake, warning him against a course of action, holding him back from entering politics, or stopping him from walking down a certain street. For 70 years the daimonion had been his guardian, a check against error. But now, in the face of the indictment, in the face of Meletus's scrawled accusations and Arnetus's simmering rage, the voice remained silent. It did not warn him to flee Athens. It did not tell him to stop his philosophizing. It did not command him to apologize. The silence was profound. To Socrates, this absence of a warning was the loudest message of all. It signified that the path he was walking, the path toward the court, toward judgment, and perhaps toward death, was the correct one. The divine sign had no objection to his martyrdom, so he walked through the city of shadows with a light step. He passed the statues of the gods he was accused of rejecting, offering them a reverence far deeper than the ritual slaughter of bulls. He believed that highest form of worship was not the smell of burnt offerings, but the perfection of the human soul through reason and virtue. If the city could not see that, it was because the city was blind, its vision clouded by the pursuit of wealth and power. He encountered an acquaintance near the porch of the king Archon, a man named Euthyphro, a diviner who was there to prosecute his own father for murder, a display of pious legalism that Socrates found grimly fascinating. Even in the shadow of his own trial, Socrates could not resist the urge to examine the life of another. He engaged Euthyphro in a dialogue about the nature of piety, gently dismantling the man's confidence until Euthyphro, confused and frustrated, made an excuse to leave. It was a quintessential Socratic moment. Facing his own destruction, he chose to spend his time searching for a definition, trying to clarify a concept, acting as the midwife to a truth that refused to be born. The days leading up to the trial were filled with a strange, suspended tension. The spring rains had come and gone, leaving the air crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the murky political climate. Socrates' friends, frantic with worry, urged him to prepare a speech. It was customary for defendants to weep, to parade their children before the jury, to beg and plead and flatter the egos of the 500 citizens who would sit in judgment. Lysias, a famous professional speechwriter, even offered to pen a defense for him, a beautifully crafted piece of rhetoric guaranteed to win an acquittal. Socrates read the speech, nodded politely, and returned it. "It is a fine pair of shoes, Lysias," he reportedly said, "but they do not fit my feet." He would not use the tricks of the sophists. He would not manipulate the emotions of the jury. He would speak only the truth, in the same conversational tone he used in the marketplace. To change his manner now, to adopt the pleading whine of a desperate man, would be to betray his entire life's work. It would be an admission that the opinion of the mob was more important than the truth. He spent his final days of freedom not in strategy meetings, but in quiet contemplation and conversation. He looked at the city he loved, the violet-crowned Athens, and saw it for what it was, a magnificent, unruly beast, sluggish and self-satisfied, needing the sting of the gadfly to keep it awake. He knew that the gadfly is often swatted, but he also knew that without it, the beast would sleep until it died. His wife, Xanthip, bore the burden of the looming trial with a heavy heart. History would paint her as a shrew, but those who saw them in these twilight hours saw a woman terrified of losing the father of her 3 sons. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that Socrates would not compromise. She knew he would not bend. The stubbornness that had made him an exasperating husband was the same quality that made him a great philosopher, and it was the quality that was now leading him toward the abyss. The sun set on the day before the trial, casting the Acropolis in silhouette against a bruising purple sky. The lamps were lit in the houses of Athens, flickering like little stars in the gathering dark. In the house of Anytus, there was the grim satisfaction of a plan coming to fruition. The troublesome talker would finally be silenced. In the house of Plato, a young aristocrat who had abandoned poetry to follow the old man, there was a sense of impending tragedy, a realization that the world was about to commit a crime against wisdom. but in the simple home of Socrates there was only the quiet breathing of a man who'd examined his life and found it worth living. He slept soundly, untroubled by nightmares, his conscience as clear as the geometry of the stars he had once studied. The daimonion remained silent, and in that silence Socrates found a perfect, unshakable peace. He knew that when the dawn broke he would stand before the 500 judges, not as a criminal begging for his life, but as a teacher delivering his final and most important lesson. The darkness of the night deepened, holding the city in a breathless embrace, waiting for the morning that would decide the fate of philosophy itself. The air grew cool, settling over the stone streets, anticipating the footsteps of the 500 men who would march to the court at the rising of the sun. As the first grey light of dawn touched the marble pillars of the Parthenon high above, the city below began to stir with a restless, nervous energy. The sun climbed over Mount Hymettus, casting long, sharp shadows across the agora, the sprawling marketplace that served as the beating heart of Athenian life. It was here, among the stalls of merchants selling figs and olives, amidst the clamour of commerce and the whispers of politics, that the court convened. This was not a trial held in a dark, sequestered chamber, but one that breathed the same dusty air as the city itself. The court of the Helia was an enclosure of wooden railings under the open sky, where the gods could witness the administration of justice. 500 citizens, drawn by lot, shuffled onto the wooden benches to serve as the jury. These were not professional jurists or learned scholars, clad in robes of office. They were the common people of Athens, stonemasons, potters, shoemakers, veterans of the long wars, and farmers with sun-weathered skin. They were the very men Socrates had spent decades questioning, the very men whose assumptions he had gently but persistently dismantled in these same streets. They carried with them the prejudices of a city that had lost its empire, a city looking for someone to blame for the erosion of its old traditions. To them, the man standing before the magistrate's platform was not a sage, but a nuisance, a relic of a questioning age that they wished to forget. The charges were read aloud by the court herald, his voice echoing off the surrounding colonnades. Meletus, a young and ambitious poet with a thin beard and a nervous demeanour, stood as the primary accuser, though everyone knew the real power lay behind him in the form of Anytus, a wealthy tanner and politician representing the craftsmen and democrats Socrates had so often critiqued. The indictment was grave. Socrates was accused of being a doer of evil, of searching out things under the earth and in the heavens, of making the weaker argument appear the stronger, and of teaching these things to others. More dangerously, he was accused of impiety, of not believing in the gods the city believed in, but in other new spiritual beings, and of corrupting the youth. Socrates stood before them, 70 years old, wearing the same threadbare cloak he had worn through the harsh winters of the Peloponnesian campaigns. He did not tremble. He did not weep. In a legal system that relied heavily on theatricality, where defendants would often parade their weeping wives and children before the jury to elicit pity, Socrates stood alone. He refused to debase himself or the court with emotional manipulation. He looked upon the 500 jurors, not with fear, but with the same bulging, observant eyes that had studied the stars and the souls of men. He began to speak, not with the polished rhetoric of a sophist, but in the plain conversational dialect of the marketplace. He explained that he had no special wisdom, save for the awareness of his own ignorance. He recounted the story of the oracle at Delphi, framing his entire life not as a nuisance, but as a divine mission. He told them that he was a gift from the god to the city of Athens. In a metaphor that would echo through the corridors of history, he compared the city to a great and noble horse who was sluggish because of its size and needed to be stirred into life. "I am that gadfly which God has attached to the state," he declared, his voice steady and calm. "All day long and in all places I am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you." The metaphor was apt, but it did not flatter. He was telling the jury that their irritation was proof of his value. He was the stinging fly that kept the lethargic beast of the state awake and alert. If they killed him, he warned, They would sleep on for the rest of their lives, unless the gods sent them another gadfly. But there was no other Socrates. He spoke of his daimonion, that internal divine sign which had never commanded him to speak, but had only ever forbidden him from doing wrong. It had not opposed him coming to court this day, which he took as a sign that the outcome, whatever it may be, was not truly an evil. The sun reached its zenith, baking the clay of the marketplace as the jurors cast their votes. They dropped bronze discs into urns, one for acquittal, one for condemnation. The clattering of the metal was the sound of a democracy wrestling with its own conscience. When the votes were tallied, the result was close, far closer than his accusers had expected. Out of 500 votes, a shift of only 30 would have acquitted him. But the majority had spoken. Socrates was found guilty. In Athenian law, this was only the first phase. Now came the sentencing. The prosecution proposed the penalty of death. It was now the defendant's turn to propose an alternative punishment, a fine, perhaps, or exile. Had Socrates suggested a moderate fine or banishment, the jury almost certainly would have accepted it, eager to be rid of the problem without the stain of execution. But Socrates was incapable of lying about his own worth. To propose a punishment would be to admit he had done something wrong, to admit he deserved to be penalized for a lifetime of service to the truth. He looked at the angry faces of the men who had just convicted him. He considered what he deserved. He was a man who had neglected his own affairs, his own wealth, and his own family to care for the souls of the Athenians. He was a benefactor, and so, with a supreme serene irony that gasped the breath from the crowd, Socrates proposed his punishment. "What do I deserve for being such a man?" he asked. "Some good thing, men of Athens, and a good thing that is fitting for me. And what is a fitting reward for a poor benefactor who requires leisure to exhort you? There is nothing more fitting, men of Athens, than that I should be fed in the Prytaneum." The Prytaneum was the sacred hearth of the city, the dining hall where Olympic victors and visiting dignitaries were fed at public expense. Socrates was claiming that his philosophical questioning was more valuable to the city than the victories of athletes who brought only fleeting glory. Where the athlete made the city seem happy, Socrates tried to make the city be happy. The audacity of the proposal sent a shockwave through the benches. It was not arrogance, though the jurors interpreted it as such. It was a rigid adherence to logic. If he was a good man, he deserved a good thing. But to the tired, irritated jurors, it was an insult. The mood in the open-air court shifted from annoyance to fury. The second vote was taken to decide the penalty. This time, the margin was not close. Many who had voted for his innocence now voted for his death. Insulted by his refusal to play the game of submission, the bronze discs clattered again, a rain of black condemnation. The sentence was death. Socrates received the news without a flinch. The noise of the crowd surged, a mixture of jeers and uncomfortable murmurs, but he remained an island of stillness. He addressed the court one final time, speaking first to those who had condemned him, warning them that they could not kill ideas by killing the man who spoke them. Vengeance would come, he prophesied, in the form of younger, harsher critics. Then he turned to those who had voted for his acquittal, offering them comfort. He spoke of death not as a terror, but as a journey, either a dreamless sleep, which is a blessing, or a migration to a place where he could question the great heroes of the past, like Odysseus and Homer. "The hour of departure has arrived," he said, his voice carrying over the shifting crowd as the shadows of the afternoon began to stretch long across the stones. "We go our ways, I to die, and you to live. Which is better, God only knows." The trial of the gadfly was over. The city had swatted the insect that stung its conscience, believing that silence would return to the streets of Athens. Guards approached, men with spears and grim faces, to escort the old philosopher away from the sunlight of the agora. They did not drag him. He walked with them, his stride purposeful and strong, his head high. He was not being led to a dungeon of despair, but to a waiting room for the infinite. The crowd began to disperse, the jurors collecting their pay, arguing in low tones about the insolence of the shoemaker's son. But as Socrates disappeared from view, passing from the bustling public square toward the direction of the prison, a strange heaviness settled over the scene. The victory of the prosecution felt hollow. The sun began to dip toward the western hills, bathing the Acropolis in a blood-red light, and the city was left with the uneasy, creeping realization that in judging the philosopher, they had ultimately judged themselves. He was taken to the public prison, a modest structure near the bustling marketplace, yet a world away from it. The heavy wooden door creaked open to receive him, and then shut, sealing out the noise of the world he had tried so hard to save. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth. He sat upon the simple wooden bench, the chains heavy on his wrists, and waited for the night to fall once more. The silence that followed the closing of the heavy timber door was not empty. It was thick, textured with the damp history of those who had sat in this gloom before him. The clamour of the Athenian court, the shouting of 500 jurors, and the weeping of his friends were severed instantly, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of water somewhere deep within the stone walls. Socrates adjusted his position on the rough bench, the iron fetters around his ankles clinking with a sound that was sharp and musical against the stone floor. To any other man, these chains would have been the heavy bindings of despair, but to the 70-year-old philosopher, they were merely another sensation to be examined, another material fact of existence to be questioned. He rubbed his calf where the metal pressed against the skin, finding a strange pleasure in the release of pressure as he shifted his weight. It occurred to him, in that quiet darkness, how closely pleasure and pain were joined, as if they were two heads of the same creature. One could not arrive without the other following close behind. He had spent his life seeking the definitions of virtue, justice, and piety, and now, in the twilight of his life, he found himself contemplating the definition of freedom within a cage. The trial earlier that day had been a theatre of the absurd, a spectacle where truth was paraded before eyes that refused to see. He closed his eyes and let the memory of the afternoon wash over him, not with regret, but with the detached analysis of a master sculptor inspecting a flawed block of marble. They had expected him to grovel. That was the custom in Athens. When a man's life hung in the balance, he was expected to drag his weeping children before the jury, to tear his robes, to beg for exile rather than death. But Socrates had stood before them with the same infuriating calm he had worn in the marketplace for decades. He had offered them what history would come to call his apology, though it was never an apology in the sense of regret. It was an apologia, a defense, a justification. He had told them, with no tremor in his voice, that he would not cease his questioning. To stop philosophizing would be to disobey the God who had placed him there. He remembered the sea of faces flushed with anger as he told them he was not a blight on the city, but a gift. He was the gadfly, and Athens was a great, noble, but sluggish horse that needed to be stung into wakefulness. A gadfly is annoying, it is persistent, and it is easily crushed by the tail of the beast, but without it, the beast sleeps and withers. The darkness in the cell deepened as the sun vanished completely beyond the high barred window, leaving only a square of deep violet sky. He thought of the moment the verdict was read. Guilty. A difference of only 30 votes had sealed his fate. And then the sentencing phase, where his defiance had truly solidified into legend. The prosecution demanded death. The law allowed him to propose an alternative penalty. He could have suggested exile. They likely would have accepted it just to be rid of him. He could have offered to stop speaking. But in the quiet of the prison, Socrates smiled into his beard. To suggest exile would be to admit guilt. To suggest silence would be to betray his soul. And so he had made the offer that surely sealed his doom. He proposed that, for his service of awakening the city to truth, he should be rewarded with free meals for life in the Prytaneum, alongside the Olympic victors. He could still hear the roar of outrage that had shaken the pillars of the court. It was the ultimate irony, a final lesson delivered to a class that refused to learn. By condemning him, they believed they were removing a nuisance, but he knew they were merely proving his point. They cared more for comfort than for virtue. He leaned his head back against the cool stone wall. He was not afraid. This lack of fear was not a posture. It was the logical conclusion of his life's work. He had spent years serving as a hoplite, a heavy infantryman, in the wars of Athens. He remembered the biting frost of Potidaea, where the other soldiers had wrapped themselves in felt and sheepskins, their feet swathed in layers of cloth. He had walked barefoot on the ice, wearing the same thin, threadbare cloak he wore now. He had stood there once, in the middle of the camp, lost in thought for 24 hours, from sunrise to sunrise, while his breath misted in the freezing air, and the army marvelled at his endurance. If the cold could not break him, if the Spartan spears at Delium could not make him run in panic, then the judgment of the assembly held no terror. But there was a deeper reason for his calm, one that lay beyond physical endurance. It was the daimonion. Since he was a child, a divine sign, a voice had visited him. It never told him what to do, only what not to do. It was a check, a restraint, stopping him when he was about to make a mistake or enter a path of error. It had stopped him from entering politics, saving his life for philosophy. But today, as he left his home, as he climbed the steps to the court, and even as he spoke the words that guaranteed his execution, the sign had been silent. The silence of the god was the only validation he needed. If death were truly an evil, the voice would have opposed him. Its silence meant that what was happening was good. Death was either a dreamless sleep, and who does not desire a night of deep, undisturbed rest, or it was a migration of the soul to a place where the true judges sat, Minos, Aeacus. There he could question Agamemnon and Odysseus. He could cross-examine the heroes of the Trojan War and find out who among them was truly wise. The prospect was not a punishment. It was an infinite expansion of his classroom. Days turned into weeks. The execution was delayed due to a sacred mission. The state galley had been sent to Delos to honor Apollo, and by Athenian law, no executions could take place until the ship returned. The prison became a place of pilgrimage for his friends. They came early in the morning and stayed until the jailer forced them out. They argued, they wept, they planned. One morning, before the dawn had fully broken, Socrates woke to find a figure sitting silently by his bed. It was Crito, his oldest and most loyal friend, a man of means who had looked after Socrates' material needs for years. Crito sat in the dim grey light, watching the old man sleep, marvelling that anyone could slumber so peacefully with death looming on the horizon. When Socrates opened his eyes, clear and unclouded by nightmares, Crito leaned in, his voice trembling with urgency. The ship from Delos had been sighted at Sunium. It would arrive tomorrow. The time was short, but Crito had a plan. He had money, plenty of it. The guards were bribable. Men could be bought cheaply in Athens. Friends in Thessaly were ready to receive him. He could escape, flee the city, and live out his remaining years in comfort, watching his sons grow. Crito pleaded not just for Socrates' life, but for his own reputation. He did not want the world to think he valued his money more than his friend's life. Socrates sat up, the chains rattling softly, and looked at his distressed friend with a gaze of infinite patience. The offer of escape was the final test. To flee now would be to validate the accusations against him. It would be an admission that he feared death more than he loved the law. He began to speak, not as a man pleading for his life, but as the philosopher guiding a student. He conjured the personification of the laws of Athens. He imagined the laws standing before them, asking, "Did we not bring you into existence? Did we not educate you? Did you not agree by living here for 70 years, by raising your children here, to abide by our command? To break the law now, because it was inconvenient, would be to destroy the very foundation of the social contract he had implicitly signed. He had accepted the benefits of the city. Now he must accept its judgment. To return evil for evil was not the way of the just man. If the city wronged him, that was the city's shame. But if he wronged the city by breaking its laws, the shame would be his own. He would arrive in the underworld not as a martyr, but as a fugitive who had destroyed the laws of his home. "No, Crito," he said softly, the morning light beginning to catch the dust motes dancing in the cell. "We must follow where the argument leads, even if it leads to the grave." Crito slumped, defeated by the unyielding integrity of the man he loved. The escape plan was abandoned. The ship from Delos was drawing near, its sails filled with the wind of destiny, bringing with it the end of the conversation and the beginning of the silence. Socrates remained on his bench, listening to the city wake up outside, the distant sounds of a world that was moving on without him, while he prepared his soul for the final journey, not with fear, but with the quiet anticipation of a traveller returning home. The sun climbed higher, casting the shadow of the window bars across the floor, measuring out the last hours of the wisest man in Athens. That sun, which had marked the passage of so many days of imprisonment, now illuminated the finality of the hour. Word soon reached the prison that the sacred ship from Delos, the vessel whose voyage had suspended all executions in Athens, had finally docked at the Piraeus. For weeks the city had been purifying itself in honor of Apollo, commemorating the legendary voyage of Theseus, who had once saved the Athenian youths from the Minotaur. During this holy interval, no life could be taken by the state, and so Socrates had lived on, a man existing in the breath between a prayer and its answer. But now the garlanded stern of the ship had touched the harbour wall, the anchor was dropped, and the sacred law that protected the philosopher was lifted. The delay was over, the cycle of the festival was complete, and the machinery of the Athenian democracy, which had ground slowly to this halt, began to turn once more. The 11, the magistrates responsible for the prison, arrived early to give the order. They did not come with the roughness of guards, but with the solemn, bureaucratic quietness. For even they had come to respect the strange, gentle old man who treated his cell like a palace of thought. They unlocked the heavy iron fetters that had bound Socrates' legs for the past month. The metal clattered against the stone floor, a harsh, ringing sound that seemed too loud in the small, hushed room. Socrates sat up on the edge of his bed, bending his knees and rubbing his calves where the iron had bitten into the skin. He did not complain of the injustice of the chains, nor did he rejoice in their removal. Instead, he looked at his friends, Phaedo, Simmias, Sebes, and the ever-faithful Crito, who had gathered early to be with him, their eyes red with the tears they were trying desperately to suppress. Socrates smiled, massaging the soreness in his legs, and observed the sensation with the detachment of a man studying a distant star. He remarked on the strange relationship between pleasure and pain, how they seemed like two heads of the same creature. No sooner had the pain of the shackles vanished than the pleasure of relief followed it. Even here, in the shadow of death, his mind was at work, analyzing the human experience, finding wonder in the mechanics of feeling. The cell began to fill with his closest companions, a final assembly of the minds he had helped to shape. Xanthippe was there as well, sitting beside him, holding their youngest child in her arms. She was a woman of fierce loyalty, often misunderstood by history as merely quarrelsome. But here, in the raw light of the end, her grief was open and profound. She looked at the circle of men, and then at her husband, crying out that this would be the last time he would speak to his friends, and they to him. The emotional weight of her presence threatened to break the calm composure Socrates was fighting to maintain, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the argument he needed to finish. He needed the air in the room to be clear, free of the heavy mists of morning, so that they could see the truth of what was to come. Gently, he turned to Crito and asked that someone take her home. It was a dismissal born of necessity, not cruelty. He wished to spare her the sight of the end, and he wished to spare the logos, the reason, from being drowned in pathos. She was led away, weeping, her voice fading down the stone corridor, leaving the men in a silence that was heavy and thick. Socrates then turned the conversation to the topic that hung invisible in the air, death itself. He did not speak of it as a tragedy, but as a cure. He likened the true philosopher to a man who has spent his entire life practicing for this very moment. For what is philosophy, he asked them, if not the separation of the soul from the body? All his life, he had argued that the body was a source of distraction, confusing the mind with hunger, thirst, desire, and fear, clouding the intellect's ability to see the absolute truth of things like justice, beauty, and goodness. The body was a cage, a heavy vessel that anchored the divine spark of the intellect to the mud of the earth. Now the time had come to be released. To fear this separation, he argued, would be a betrayal of everything he had lived for. It would be to love the cage more than the freedom. His friends, however, were not so easily comforted. The fear of the void was deep within them. Sabes, with the sharp mind of a skeptic, voiced the worry that gnawed at them all. What if the soul, upon leaving the body, is dispersed like breath or smoke, vanishing into nothingness on the wind? What if there is no journey home, but only an ending? Socrates met this fear with the same playful rigour he had used in the marketplace. He spent the long hours of the morning and afternoon weaving a complex tapestry of arguments, proving the immortality of the soul through the very nature of life and opposites. He spoke of the soul as something akin to the divine invisible, immortal and intelligible, while the body was akin to the mortal and visible. He painted a picture of the afterlife, not as a dark, gloomy underworld, but as a place of clarity, where the mind, finally stripped of the flesh, could gaze upon the truth directly. He compared himself to the swans, the sacred birds of Apollo. Men say that swans sing before they die because they are suffering, but Socrates corrected them. Swans, he said, are the birds of the god of prophecy music. They sing their most beautiful song at the end, not out of sorrow, but out of joy, because they foresee the blessings of the world to come and are eager to join their god. He, too, was a fellow servant of the swans, and he would not leave this life with less grace or less hope than a bird. The sun began its slow descent, the light in the cell turning from the sharp white of noon to the warm golden honey of late afternoon. The shadows of the window bars lengthened across the floor, stretching toward the philosopher's feet like reaching fingers. The discussion had run its course. The arguments had been made, the objections answered, and a calmness settled over the group, a shared hypnotic trance where the fear of death had been replaced, momentarily, by the awe of existence. Socrates rose from his seat. The time for talking was done. The time for the ritual of departure had arrived. He told them he would go to the bathhouse adjacent to the prison to wash himself, so that the women would not have the trouble of washing his corpse. It was a practical, considerate thought, typical of a man who viewed his own body as merely a tool to be managed until it was no longer needed. Crito asked for his last instructions, how he wished to be buried. Socrates laughed softly, a sound that seemed to dispel the gathering gloom. "However you like," he said, "if you can catch me and I do not escape you." He looked at the others with a twinkle in his deep-set, protruding eyes. "I cannot convince Crito that I am this Socrates who is talking to you now, and marshalling my arguments. He thinks I am that corpse. He will soon see, and he asks how he should bury me." He went into the bath, leaving his friends to wait. They sat in the fading light, speaking in low whispers, feeling like children who were about to lose a father. The reality of the loss was beginning to sink in, deeper than the philosophy, settling into the marrow of their bones. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the western sky turned a bruised purple over the distant mountains of Megara. The long day of discourse was finished. When Socrates returned, he was fresh from the bath, wearing a clean tunic. The hour of sunset, the legal time for execution, was upon them. The jailer, a public slave who had grown fond of the prisoner, entered the room. He was weeping openly. "Socrates," the man choked out, "I know you to be the noblest and gentlest and best of all who have ever come to this place." He could not finish his sentence. He turned his face away to hide his tears and hurried out. Socrates looked after him with great kindness. "How charming the man is," he murmured. "Since I've been here, he has always been coming to see me and talking to me, and has been the best of men." He turned to Crito. The twilight was deepening in the room. The noises of the city outside were hushing, Athens settling down for the night, unaware that its greatest light was about to be extinguished. "Come then, Crito," Socrates said, his voice steady and devoid of any tremor. "Let us obey him, and let the poison be brought if it is ready, and if it is not ready, let it be prepared." Crito hesitated, desperate to buy a few more moments. "But the sun is still on the mountains," he pleaded. It has not yet gone down. Others wait until late. They eat and drink. Do not hurry. There is still time. Socrates shook his head gently. The final lesson was not about time, but about timing. To cling to the last dregs of life when the vessel was empty would be to mock himself. He sat down on the bed, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the door where the executioner would appear, ready to greet the final guest of the evening. Socrates sat upon the edge of the bed, his bare feet resting on the cool stone floor of the prison cell. The tension in the room was palpable, a thick, suffocating weight that pressed upon the chests of his friends, yet he alone seemed unburdened by it. He rubbed his calf where the iron fetters had recently been removed, the sensation of blood returning to the limb serving as a grounding reminder of his physical existence. An existence he was poised to leave with the same deliberation he had applied to every argument he had ever constructed. The light from the high, barred window was shifting, the golden hue of late afternoon deepening into the bruised purple of early twilight. It was the hour when the agora would be emptying, when the shouts of merchants and the debates of the sophists would fade into the murmurs of evening meals. Socrates knew that rhythm well. For 70 years he had been the heartbeat of that city, a fixture as permanent and weathered as the Parthenon marbles. As he waited for the man who would bring the poison, the silence of the cell became a canvas for memory. Crito and the others looked upon him with tear-filled eyes, seeing only a frail old man, condemned and cornered. But Socrates, in the quietude of his own mind, did not feel frail. He felt the phantom weight of a shield upon his arm and the grip of a spear in his hand. His thoughts drifted back through the decades, not to the dialogues of the marketplace, but to the biting cold of the Chalcidice Peninsula. He remembered Potidæa. The younger men, shivering in their cloaks, wrapping their feet in fleece against the frost, had looked at him with awe then, too. He had marched barefoot over the ice, indifferent to the biting wind, fueled by a discipline that transcended mere physical toughness. It was there, amidst the siege, that he had stood fixed in one spot for an entire day and night, lost in deep contemplation, wrestling with the problem of the mind, while the world of the body ceased to matter. He remembered the sunrise after that 24-hour trance, offering a prayer to the sun before walking away. Now, as the sun set on his final day, he felt that same profound stillness returning, the soldier's calm before the advance, the philosopher's peace before the conclusion. He looked at his hands, calloused and broad. They were the hands of a worker, not an aristocrat. He thought of Sophroniscus, his father, the stonemason. In his youth, Socrates had held the chisel and mallet, learning to liberate form from formless rock. Ancient rumors whispered that the draped figures of the three graces at the entrance to the Acropolis were his work. Perhaps they were, but he had laid down the chisel to take up a more difficult trade. He thought of Phaenarete, his mother, the midwife. She had brought bodies into the world. He had sought to do the same for truths. He had become a midwife of the soul, enduring the labor pains of a city that did not want to be delivered of its ignorance. A heavy creak of the timber door drew the room's attention. The jailer entered, carrying a cup in which the hemlock had been ground and mixed. The man's face was wet with tears. He had come to love the prisoner during his confinement, recognizing a nobility that the court had failed to see. "You, Socrates," the jailer said, his voice breaking, "whom I know to be the noblest and gentlest and best of all who ever came to this place, will not be angry with me, for you know the authors of this misfortune, and that I am guiltless." Socrates looked up at him with those wide, bulging eyes that had often been mocked for their crab-like appearance, set far apart to take in the whole of the world. He smiled, a genuine warming expression that transformed his satyr-like features into something undeniably beautiful. "I understand," Socrates said gently. "Fare you well, and I will do as you bid." He turned to Crito with a look of playful admonition. "See, Crito, the man is ready. Let us not keep him waiting." The jailer handed him the cup. The liquid within was dark, swirling with the promise of oblivion. "What do you say about making a libation out of this cup to any god?" Socrates asked, holding the vessel steady, his hand displaying not a tremor of fear. "May I, or not?" "We only prepare, Socrates, just so much as we deem enough," the man answered apologetically. "I understand," Socrates replied, "but I may and must ask the gods to prosper my journey from this to that other world. Even if I cannot pour the wine out for them, that is my prayer, and may it be so." The room seemed to hold its breath. The dust motes dancing in the last shaft of sunlight froze. Socrates raised the cup to his thick lips. He did not hesitate. He did not shudder at the smell or the taste. With the same ease that he had outdrunk the heavy drinkers at the symposia of his youth, remaining sober while others fell into stupor, he drained the cup in one long, smooth draught. It was done. Until that moment, his friends had managed to hold back their grief, anchoring themselves to his calm. But as they watched the empty cup lowered, the dam broke. Apollodorus, who had been weeping quietly, let out a loud, jagged sob that pierced the stillness. Crito turned away to hide his face. Tears flowed down Phaedo's cheeks, not for Socrates, but for himself, for the realization that he was losing a father, a guide, and the moral compass of Athens. "What is this strange outcry?" Socrates asked, his voice cutting through their lamentations with startling clarity. He sounded not like a dying man, but like a teacher correcting a rowdy classroom. "I sent away the women, mainly in order that they might not offend in this way, for I have heard that a man should die in peace. Be quiet then, and have patience." Shamed by his composure, the men stifled their tears. The room fell silent again, save for the rhythmic breathing of the philosopher. "The man told me to walk about," Socrates said, rising to his feet. He began to pace the small cell, back and forth, his bare feet slapping softly against the stone. He walked with the same steady gait he had used to patrol the walls of Delium, the same swagger that had kept the Spartan pursuers at bay. He was listening to his own body now, waiting for the signal. He knew the chemistry of the herb. It would begin in the extremities. After a few turns, he paused. "My legs are heavy," he announced. He went to the bed and lay down on his back, adjusting his simple cloak around him. The jailer approached and knelt beside him, pressing hard on his foot. "Do you feel that?" the jailer asked. "No," Socrates replied. The sensation was gone. The foot belonged to the earth now. The jailer moved his hand up to the calf, squeezing the muscle. "And this?" "No." The cold was creeping upward, a slow rising tide of numbness. It was not painful. It was merely the absence of feeling, the quiet withdrawal of the soul from the outer fortifications of the body. Socrates touched his own chest. It was still warm, the heart beating a steady, defiant rhythm against the encroaching frost. He closed his eyes, and for a long moment the room believed he had already departed. His mind, however, was still active, still observing. He thought of the oracle at Delphi. No one is wiser. He understood it fully now. He knew nothing of what came next, whether it was a dreamless sleep, deeper and more restful than any he had ever known, or a migration to a place where he could question the great heroes of the past. To know that he did not know, and yet to go forward without fear, that was the final wisdom. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. The sun had dipped below the mountains, and the cell was draped in the grey wool of twilight. Suddenly, Socrates uncovered his face. His eyes opened one last time, clear and lucid. He sought out Crito, his oldest and most faithful friend, the man who had wanted to bribe the guards, the man who wanted him to live at any cost. "Crito," he said, his voice fainter now, the cold reaching his abdomen, yet the tone remained precise, burdened with a debt that must be settled. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it, and do not neglect it." "It shall be done," Crito whispered, leaning close to catch any further command. "Is there anything else?" But there was no answer. The command was the key. Asclepius was the god of healing. One sacrificed a rooster to him upon recovering from an illness. Socrates was not speaking in riddles. He was offering his final paradox. Life, with its confusion, its bodily needs, its ignorance, was the sickness. Death was the cure. He was being healed. A slight movement shuddered through his frame, a gentle release of tension, as if a knot had been untied. His eyes remained fixed on a point beyond the ceiling, beyond the stone, beyond the sky. The jailer reached out and closed the philosopher's mouth and eyes. Crito sat by the bedside, holding the hand of his friend until the warmth finally seeped away, leaving only the cooling clay of the man who had been the conscience of a civilization. The room was now completely dark, the shadows of the prison bars stretching across the floor like long, slender fingers reaching for the night. The sun had set on Athens, and a new, uncertain era began to rise in the silence that followed. In that stillness, as the hemlock claimed the final beat of his heart, the silence that filled the prison cell was not empty. It was heavy, laden with the memories of a life that had been as rugged and enduring as the stones of the Acropolis. To understand the man who now lay cold upon the simple cot, one had to look past the tragic finality of the execution and journey back to the vibrant, dusty streets where his spirit had been forged. For Socrates was never a creature of the ivory tower. He was a man of the earth, born of the dame Alopice, a citizen who had walked the path from stonemason to soldier, and finally, to the gadfly that awakened a sleeping city. The hands that Crito now released, lifeless and heavy, had once been calloused and white with the dust of the quarry. His father, Socrates, had been a worker of stone, a sculptor who taught the young Socrates how to chip away the superfluous to reveal the form hidden within. It was a lesson the boy never forgot, though he would eventually trade the chisel of iron for the chisel of logic. He would not shape marble, but the human soul. His mother, Phanerete, was a midwife, a woman who assisted in the bringing forth of new life. Socrates, with his characteristic irony and deep reverence, would later claim her profession as his own. He was a barren man, he would say, possessing no wisdom of his own to give, but he was unmatched in the art of helping others deliver their own truths, attending the painful, messy, and miraculous birth of ideas. But before he was the midwife of the mind, he was a man of startling contradictions. In a city that worshipped physical perfection, where the statues of gods were carved with flawless symmetry, Socrates was famously, unapologetically ugly. He possessed the face of a satyr, with wide-set, bulging eyes that seemed to take in the world from all angles, like a crab watching the seabed. His nose was flat and upturned, his nostrils flaring wide, and his lips were thick. Yet he wore this visage like a challenge, joking that his eyes were superior because they saw more, his nose better because it could gather more sense. He was a vessel of rough clay containing gold, a walking testament to his belief that the true self was not the body, but the psyche within. This rough exterior housed a constitution of iron. Long before he was the old man on trial, Socrates was a hoplite, a heavy infantryman in the Athenian army. He did not speak of courage from the safety of a schoolroom. He learned it in the freezing mud of Potidaea and the chaos of Delium. The legends of his endurance were whispered by soldiers around campfires long after the wars had cooled. They spoke of the campaign in Potidaea, where the Thracian winter bit deep into the bone, while other soldiers wrapped themselves in felt and fleece, binding their feet in sheepskin. Socrates walked barefoot over the ice, wearing the same thin, threadbare cloak he wore in the heat of summer. He marched with a quiet, terrifying resilience, not out of arrogance, but out of a supreme command over his own physical form. It was there, amidst the siege, that the most singular event of his military life occurred, a moment that foreshadowed the philosopher he would become. One morning something caught his mind, a problem or a thought that demanded his absolute attention. He stopped in his tracks, standing perfectly still. The sun rose, climbing the arch of the sky, beating down on his bronze helmet. Yet he did not move. The other soldiers noticed, nudging one another, watching the statue in their midst. Noon came and went. The sun dipped toward the western hills, painting the sky in violet and blood, and still Socrates stood, lost in the deep, trackless caverns of his own mind. When night fell, some of the Ionians brought out their bedding to sleep in the cool air nearby, simply to watch him. He remained there fixed and immobile through the turning of the stars, until the sun rose again the next morning. Only then, with the arrival of the new day, did he blink, offer a prayer to the sun, and walk away as if nothing had happened. He had touched a place of focus that few mortals ever reach. This intensity was guided by a mysterious companion he carried with him all his life, his daimonion. It was a divine sign, a voice that sounded in his head from the days of his childhood. Unlike the commands of generals or the laws of the city, this voice never told him what to do. It only told him what not to do. It was a divine check, a sudden, silent prohibition that would stop him mid-sentence or freeze him before he walked down a certain path. It kept him from the corrupting influence of politics, guiding him instead toward the marketplace, the gymnasium, and the tables of the money changers, where the real work of philosophy could be done. It was in those public spaces that the true turning point of his life unraveled, sparked by a question from his impulsive friend, Sharaphon. The friend had journeyed through the winding mountain paths to the oracle at Delphi, asking the Pythia a single dangerous question: is there anyone wiser than Socrates? The priestess, inhaling the vapors of the earth, had given a simple answer: no one. When Socrates heard this, he was not filled with pride, but with confusion. He knew himself. He knew the vastness of his own ignorance. He felt he knew nothing of the cosmos, nothing of the true nature of virtue. To prove the god wrong, to solve the riddle, he began his lifelong mission. He questioned the politicians who claimed to understand justice, but found they only understood power. He questioned the poets who wrote beautiful verses, but could not explain the meaning of their own words. He questioned the craftsmen who knew how to work wood and metal, but mistakenly believed this skill made them experts on the matters of the soul. Slowly the realization dawned on him, as bright and piercing as the Apollo sun. The oracle was right. He was the wisest, not because he possessed knowledge, but because he alone recognized that he possessed none. While others walked in the false confidence of assumed wisdom, Socrates lived in the honest clarity of knowing what he did not know. This was the Socratic ignorance, the foundation upon which he built a life of relentless examination. He brought philosophy down from the stars. While his teacher Archelaus had looked to the heavens to understand the mechanics of the universe, Socrates looked into the eyes of his fellow citizens. He cared little for how the clouds were formed, but cared deeply for how a human being should live. The unexamined life is not worth living, he declared, a mantra that stripped away the comfort of tradition and habit. He demanded that every belief be placed on the anvil and struck with the hammer of reason to see if it would hold or shatter. And yet, for all his rigorous intellect, he was a man who loved the city and its people. He was a familiar sight at the symposiums, the drinking parties of the elite. There, amidst the flute girls and the flow of mixing bowls, Socrates was a legend of a different sort. He could drink more wine than any man in Athens, yet never once was he seen drunk. While the others slurred their speech and stumbled into sleep, Socrates remained lucid, his mind a diamond that no amount of wine could dull. He viewed this tolerance not as a party trick, but as another form of discipline, a testament to the soul's dominance over the body. He lived in voluntary poverty, neglecting his own affairs to attend to the city's soul. He walked home to a house that was often stormy, for his wife, Delphi, was a woman of fire and spirit. History would paint her unkindly, but Socrates spoke of her with a strange fond pragmatism. He claimed that living with her was the perfect training for his philosophy. Just as a horse trainer must practice on the wildest stallion to master the art, he needed her spirited nature to learn patience and self-control. When she once railed against him in an argument and, in her frustration, emptied a pot of water over his head, he simply shook the droplets from his beard and smiled, remarking, "After the thunder comes the rain." This was the man who now lay silent in the gathering dark, the hoplite who stood in the snow, the drinker who never fell, the husband who weathered the storm, the midwife who birthed no children of his own, but fathered the mind of Western civilization, the The poison had done its work, healing him of the sickness of mortality, liberating the soul he had spent 70 years preparing for this journey. The jailer extinguished the final lamp. The cell was swallowed by the gentle, velvet gloom of night. The questions were all asked. The answers were all given. The gadfly was at rest, and the city of Athens, though it did not yet know it, would never sleep as soundly again. The conversation had ended, drifting into the infinite quiet of the stars that wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. Good night.